Some secrets are worth dying for. Others are worth living for. Sarah Martinez discovered hers was worth both when a decorated colonel's eyes locked onto a small patch sewn into her wheelchair bag. A patch that shouldn't exist, bearing the insignia of a unit that never officially operated in a war that was never officially fought. What happened next would shatter everything the military thought they knew about their most classified operations and the invisible warriors who carried them out. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Veteran Affairs parking lot as Sarah Martinez maneuvered her wheelchair toward the entrance of the medical center. Her hands, calloused from years of gripping the wheel rims, moved with practiced efficiency despite the slight tremor that had developed over the past months. At 28, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had learned that showing weakness was not an option, even when weakness had been forced upon her. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, and Sarah entered the familiar chaos of the VA Medical Center. The smell hit her first, that unique blend of antiseptic, coffee, and something indefinable that seemed to permeate every government building she had ever entered. Veterans of various ages filled the waiting area, some clutching canes, others bearing the invisible wounds that only showed in the way they held their shoulders or avoided eye contact. Sarah had been coming here for 18 months now, ever since the doctors at Walter Reed had exhausted their options and transferred her case to long-term care. The routine was always the same. Check in with the receptionist who never remembered her name despite seeing her twice a week, wait for 45 minutes past her appointment time, and then spend 15 minutes with a physical therapist who meant well, but didn't understand that some things couldn't be fixed with exercises and positive thinking. As she wheeled toward the reception desk, Sarah became aware of the familiar soundtrack that followed her everywhere. The whispers weren't always malicious, but they were constant. Today, she caught fragments as she passed a group of older veterans sitting near the magazine rack. Poor thing, so young. Must have been an eye. Shame what these wars do to our kids. Sarah had learned to tune out most of it, but today felt different. There was an edge to the attention she was receiving, more pointed stares than usual. She realized why when she overheard two men in their 50s talking behind her as she waited in line. "Look at that one," the first man said, his voice carrying more than it should have. "Probably never even left the wire. Half these kids claim PTSD from getting a splinter." His companion chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Wheelchair freak probably hurt herself in basic training and found a way to milk it for benefits. I did 3 tours in Nam, lost half my hearing, and I don't go around looking for pity." Sarah's hands tightened on her wheel rims. She had heard variations of this conversation dozens of times, but it never stopped feeling like a physical blow. The assumptions, the casual cruelty, the way her service was dismissed based on nothing more than her age and gender and the fact that she couldn't walk. She kept her eyes forward and her face neutral, a skill she had perfected long before her injury. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman named Gloria who had been working the desk since the Clinton administration, glanced up from her computer screen. "Martinez, Sarah. Physical therapy with Dr. Kim. You're early." "I know," Sarah replied, keeping her voice level. "I'll wait." She moved toward an empty section of the waiting area, positioning her chair where she could observe the room without being cornered by well-meaning strangers who wanted to share their own war stories or offer unsolicited advice about experimental treatments they had seen on the internet. This corner spot also gave her a clear view of the exits, a habit she hadn't been able to break since returning stateside. The small bag attached to the side of her wheelchair contained the usual items: water bottle, phone charger, appointment cards, and a few personal items that helped her get through the long days of medical appointments and bureaucratic maze running that had become her life. Among these items was a patch that she kept folded inside a zippered pocket, a piece of fabric no bigger than her palm that represented more than anyone in this building could imagine. The patch was black with silver thread, depicting a stylized ghost figure emerging from what looked like smoke or mist. Below the ghost were 3 letters, PSY. No unit designation, no official military insignia, just that simple image and those 3 letters that meant everything to the dozen people who had earned the right to wear them and nothing to anyone else. Sarah never intended for anyone to see it. She kept it hidden, folded away like a secret she couldn't quite bring herself to discard, but couldn't risk revealing either. It was a reminder of who she had been before the world reduced her to a collection of medical diagnoses and disability ratings. Before she became the wheelchair freak that people whispered about in VA waiting rooms. The physical therapy session was routine, 45 minutes of exercises designed to maintain what mobility she had left and prevent further deterioration. Dr. Kim was a kind woman in her 40s who treated Sarah with the professional courtesy that came from years of working with wounded veterans. She never asked about Sarah's service record beyond what was relevant to her treatment, and she never offered false hope about miraculous recoveries or experimental procedures. Your range of motion is stable, Dr. Kim observed as Sarah completed a series of stretches on the parallel bars. The tremor in your left hand seems to have improved slightly since last week. Sarah nodded, focusing on the familiar burn in her shoulders as she supported her weight with her arms. The exercises were necessary, but they also served as a meditation of sorts, a way to reconnect with her body and remember what it was capable of rather than dwelling on what it couldn't do anymore. After the session, Sarah made her way back through the waiting room toward the exit. The 2 veterans who had been commenting about her earlier were still there, their conversation having moved on to complaints about wait times and parking fees. They didn't look up as she passed, having already dismissed her as unworthy of further attention. It was in the parking lot, as Sarah was transferring her chair into her modified Honda Civic, that she first noticed him. A man in his 50s wearing a crisp white shirt and dark slacks was leaning against a black SUV, apparently waiting for someone. There was something about his posture, the way he held himself with alert stillness, that marked him as military even without a uniform. His hair was silver gray and cut in a regulation style that suggested active duty rather than retirement. Sarah had developed an instinct for identifying fellow service members, a sixth sense that had served her well during her years in the field. This man had the look of someone accustomed to command, the kind of bearing that came from years of making life and death decisions and living with the consequences. He was watching her with an attention that felt different from the usual curiosity or pity she encountered. As she settled into her driver's seat and reached for her wheelchair to fold it, the man approached. His movement was purposeful, but not aggressive, the gait of someone who understood the importance of not appearing threatening to a potentially vulnerable person. "Excuse me," he said, stopping a respectful distance from her car. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard the first time he spoke. "I am Kennel Peterson. I couldn't help but notice your wheelchair bag." Sarah's blood turned cold. She glanced down at her bag, trying to see what he might have observed. The main compartment was zipped shut, but in her haste to pack up after therapy, she hadn't been as careful as usual. The corner of the ghost patch was visible, just a small triangle of black fabric poking out from the partially open side pocket. "I'm sorry," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. Years of operational security training kicked in automatically, even though her mind was racing with questions about how much this colonel might know and what his interest might mean. Colonel Peterson's eyes were sharp, the pale blue of winter sky, and they seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance with the efficiency of someone trained in threat assessment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, pitched for her ears alone. "That's an interesting patch you have there," he said. "I've only seen one like it before, and that was in a classified briefing about operations that officially never happened." Sarah's hands stilled on her wheelchair. Every instinct she had developed during her years of service was screaming warnings, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact with the colonel. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, the lie coming easily after months of practice. The colonel studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing through her deception with the ease of someone who had spent decades learning to read people. When he smiled, it wasn't the patronizing expression she had grown accustomed to from people who viewed her as a victim to be pitted. "My office is in the Pentagon," he said, reaching into his shirt pocket to produce a business card. "Room 3 times 10 to the power of negative 869. If you ever decide you want to talk about operations that never happened, I'd be very interested in hearing what you have to say." He placed the card on her dashboard and stepped back, giving her space to process what had just occurred. Sarah looked down at the card, noting the embossed seal and the title that identified him as being attached to a division she had heard of but never worked with directly. "I don't have anything to say about operations that didn't happen," she replied, but her voice lacked the conviction she was trying to project. Colonel Peterson nodded, as if he had expected that response. "Of course not," he said. "But if you change your mind, I'll be in my office Monday through Friday, 0800 to 1800 hours. Sometimes the stories that never happened are the most important ones to tell." He turned and walked back toward his SUV, leaving Sarah alone in the parking lot with more questions than answers, and a business car that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She sat in her car for several minutes after he drove away, staring at the partially visible patch and trying to decide if what had just happened was a threat, an opportunity, or something else entirely. The drive home gave her time to think, but not to reach any conclusions. Her apartment was a small 2-bedroom unit in a complex that catered to disabled veterans, with ramps instead of stairs and bathrooms designed for wheelchair accessibility. It was functional rather than comfortable, a place to sleep and eat and exist between medical appointments. Sarah had never intended to be living this life. 18 months ago, she had been Staff Sergeant Martinez, one of the most effective psychological operations specialists in a unit that didn't officially exist. Her job had been to get inside people's heads, to understand what made them tick, and to use that understanding to accomplish objectives that regular military units couldn't touch. The work had been dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with bullets or explosions. Psychological operations required getting close to targets, building relationships, becoming someone else entirely for weeks or months at a time. It meant living with the constant awareness that a single mistake could compromise not just a mission, but the lives of everyone involved in operations that the government would deny ever happened. Sarah had been good at it, better than anyone expected a 26-year-old woman from El Paso to be. She had a gift for languages and an intuitive understanding of human psychology that made her invaluable for operations in regions where traditional military approaches had failed repeatedly. Her small stature and unassuming appearance allowed her to move through populations that would be immediately suspicious of obvious military personnel. The injury that ended her operational career hadn't happened during a firefight or an explosion. It had been much more mundane and somehow more bitter because of its ordinariness. A training accident during what was supposed to be a routine exercise had damaged her spinal cord in a way that left her partially paralyzed and ended her usefulness to a unit that required its members to be capable of operating in any environment under any conditions. The transition from being an essential part of the most classified operations in the military to being another disabled veteran navigating the VA bureaucracy had been devastating in ways that Sarah was still learning to process. The physical limitations were challenging, but they were nothing compared to the loss of purpose and identity that came with being medically retired from the only job she had ever wanted to do. Sarah heated a frozen dinner and ate it while staring at Colonel Peterson's business card, which she had placed on her kitchen table next to a stack of medical appointment cards and disability benefits paperwork. The contrast between her current life and the implications of that business card felt surreal, like two different realities trying to occupy the same space. She had spent months learning to accept that her operational career was over, that she would never again be trusted with the kind of responsibilities that had defined her adult life. The patch in her wheelchair bag was supposed to be a memento, a private reminder of who she used to be before she became just another casualty of the endless wars that most Americans prefer to forget about. But Colonel Peterson's recognition of the patch suggested that someone, somewhere, still remembered the operations that never happened and the people who had carried them out. The question was whether that remembrance represented an opportunity or a threat, and whether Sarah was ready to find out which. As the sun set outside her apartment window, Sarah realized that for the first time in 18 months, she was curious about what tomorrow might bring. It was a dangerous feeling, one that reminded her of the anticipation she used to feel before deploying on operations that would test every skill she possessed. She had thought that part of her life was over, but Colonel Peterson's unexpected appearance suggested that some stories were too important to stay buried, even when everyone involved was supposed to pretend they never happened. The patch remained folded in her wheelchair bag, a small piece of black fabric that represented more than most people could imagine, and more than Sarah had been willing to admit to herself. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to contact Colonel Peterson or to continue pretending that she was just another disabled veteran with no stories worth telling. But tonight, for the first time since her injury, Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez allowed herself to remember who she used to be and to consider the possibility that who she used to be might still matter to someone who understood the weight of secrets and the cost of carrying them. Sarah stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to decide if she had the courage to make the phone call that would change everything. 3 days had passed since her encounter with Colonel Peterson, 3 days of sleepless nights, and endless internal debates about whether reaching out to him was the right choice or a catastrophic mistake. The business card sat on her nightstand, its edges already showing where from a number of times she had picked it up and put it down again. Each time she considered calling, her training kicked in with warnings about operational security and the importance of maintaining cover stories. But each time she decided against it, she was haunted by the Colonel's words about stories that never happened being the most important ones to tell. Sarah had always been good at reading people, a skill that had made her invaluable during her operational career. Colonel Peterson hadn't felt like a threat during their brief encounter, but she had learned the hard way that the most dangerous people were often the ones who appeared safest. Still, there had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, a recognition that went beyond curiosity about a mysterious patch. The morning routine that had become her new normal felt different today. Instead of the resigned acceptance that usually accompanied her preparation for another day of medical appointments and bureaucratic obstacles, Sarah found herself moving with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that projected competence rather than victim status, and took extra care with her appearance in a way that reminded her of preparing for operational briefings. The decision to call came suddenly, triggered by an overheard conversation in the grocery store checkout line. Two middle-aged women were discussing a news story about military budget cuts, their conversation peppered with casual dismissals of veteran disability claims and suggestions that most service-related injuries were exaggerated or entirely fabricated. These kids today just can't handle what previous generations took in stride. One of them said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never faced anything more dangerous than traffic on the interstate. My father served in World War II and never complained about a thing. Now everyone wants to be considered a hero for spending a few months overseas. Sarah had heard variations of this conversation countless times, but today, it ignited something that had been dormant since her injury. She realized that her silence wasn't just protecting classified operations. It was allowing people to dismiss the sacrifices made by an entire generation of service members who couldn't defend themselves because their work had been too sensitive to acknowledge. Back in her apartment, Sarah picked up Colonel Peterson's card one more time and dialed the number before she could change her mind. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice answered. Colonel Peterson's office. This is Sergeant Martinez. I'd like to speak with Colonel Peterson, please. This is Sarah Martinez. There was a brief pause, and Sarah imagined the sergeant checking a list of names or consulting with a superior. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to a more formal tone. Please hold, ma'am. I'll connect you immediately. The hold music lasted less than 30 seconds before Colonel Peterson's voice came on the line. Ms. Martinez, I was hoping you would call. I've been thinking about our conversation, Sarah said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. You said you'd be interested in hearing about operations that never happened. I would be very interested, Colonel Peterson replied. Are you available to meet today? I can arrange transportation if needed. Sarah hesitated. Meeting at the Pentagon would make this official in a way that phone conversations weren't. Once she walked into that building, there would be records and witnesses and a chain of events that couldn't be undone. I could drive myself, she said finally. When and where? My office at 1400 hours. Do you know how to find room 3 times 10 to the power of negative 869? I'll figure it out. MS. Martinez, Colonel Peterson said, his voice gentler than it had been during their first meeting. I want you to know that this conversation is entirely voluntary. You're not under any obligation to discuss anything you're not comfortable sharing. But I think you might be surprised by what we know and what we don't know about certain operations. The drive to the Pentagon took 45 minutes, giving Sarah plenty of time to reconsider her decision and turn around. She had been to the building once before, during her initial military training, but approaching it as a disabled veteran rather than an active duty soldier felt completely different. The massive concrete structure seemed to loom larger than she remembered, a physical manifestation of the military-industrial complex that had shaped her adult life, and then discarded her when she was no longer useful. Security was thorough, but efficient, and Sarah found herself oddly comforted by the familiar rituals of identification checks and metal detectors. The guards were professional and courteous, treating her wheelchair as just another piece of equipment to be inspected rather than something that defined her identity. Finding Colonel Peterson's office required navigating a maze of corridors that all looked identical. But Sarah's military training included basic navigation skills that serve her well in bureaucratic environments. Room 3 times 10 to the power of negative 869 was located in a section of the building that felt more secure than the area she had passed through, with fewer people in hallways and more security cameras mounted at strategic locations. Colonel Peterson answered her knock personally, opening the door to reveal an office that was larger than she had expected, but decorated with the sparse functionality typical of senior military officers. The walls displayed the usual collection of commendations and photographs from various deployments, but Sarah noticed several images that showed the colonel and locations she recognized from her own operational experience. Thank you for coming, Colonel Peterson said, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from his desk. Can I offer you coffee or water? Coffee would be good, Sarah replied, settling her wheelchair in the space that had been cleared to accommodate it. She noticed that the positioning allowed her to face the colonel directly rather than forcing her to look up at him from a disadvantaged position. Colonel Peterson poured coffee from a machine that looked like it had been brewing the same pot since the Reagan administration and handed Sarah a mug decorated with the emblem of the 82nd Airborne Division. He settled behind his desk with his own cup and studied her for a moment before speaking. I'm going to share some information with you that's going to sound impossible, he began. 6 months ago, my office received a request from the Department of Defense's Special Access Program Oversight Committee. They wanted us to conduct a review of psychological operations conducted between 2019 and 2023, with particular attention to operations that were conducted outside normal command structures. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. The time frame Colonel Peterson had mentioned covered her entire operational career, from her initial deployment through her medical retirement. The interesting thing about this review, Colonel Peterson continued, is that when we started digging into the records, we discovered that most of the operations we were supposed to evaluate had been classified at levels that made them invisible to normal oversight processes. Missions that were so compartmentalized that even the people authorizing them had only partial information about what was actually happening in the field. He opened a folder on his desk and withdrew a thin stack of documents. Sarah could see that most of the pages were heavily redacted, with more black ink than actual text visible. What we found, Colonel Peterson said, was evidence of a psychological operations unit that achieved results far beyond what anyone thought possible, but did so using methods that were never officially approved and in locations where U.S. military personnel were never officially present. Sarah's coffee mug felt suddenly heavy in her hands. The operational security protocols she had lived by for years were screaming warnings about admitting to knowledge of classified operations. But Colonel Peterson's matter-of-fact delivery suggested that he already knew more than she had expected. The problem, Colonel Peterson continued, is that all the official records of this unit's activities were destroyed in a computer malfunction at a data center in Colorado. The backup systems that were supposed to preserve copies of classified materials somehow failed simultaneously. Very convenient and very suspicious. He leaned forward, his pale blue eyes focusing intently on Sarah's face. But bureaucratic incompetence has a way of leaving traces, even when people try to erase them completely. Personnel records, medical files, supply requisitions, transportation manifests. All the mundane paperwork that keeps the military running and that nobody thinks about until they need to reconstruct events that someone wanted to forget. Sarah realized that her hands were trembling slightly, and she set her coffee mug down on the small table beside her chair. "What does any of this have to do with me?" Colonel Peterson smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, Psychological Operations Specialist, medically retired after a training accident at Fort Bragg in March of last year. Officially, you served with the 4th Psychological Operations Group, conducting routine information operations in support of conventional military units. He opened another folder and withdrew what appeared to be her personnel file, though it was thicker than she remembered it being. Unofficially, your name appears on transportation manifests for flights to locations that don't exist on any map. Your medical records include vaccinations for diseases that aren't found in any of the countries where you were officially deployed. And your equipment requisitions include items that aren't standard issue for conventional psychological operations units. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of operational planning taking over her thought processes, the analytical mindset that had served her well during her years in the field. Colonel Peterson clearly knew more than he was revealing, but his approach suggested that he wasn't trying to trap her or force confessions. Instead, he seemed to be building a case for why she should trust him with information she had never intended to share. "The patch you carry," Colonel Peterson continued, "belongs to a unit that never officially existed. But the work that unit did may have prevented conflicts that would have cost thousands of American lives. The problem is that without official acknowledgement of that work, the lessons learned and the capabilities developed are being lost." He stood up and moved to a map mounted on the wall behind his desk. Red pins marked various locations around the world, and Sarah recognized several of them as places where she had operated during her career. "We think this unit was responsible for preventing at least 3 major terrorist attacks and disrupting weapons trafficking networks that conventional intelligence agencies have been unable to penetrate," Colonel Peterson said. "But we can't prove it because all the official records were destroyed, and the people who were involved are scattered across the VA system, dealing with injuries and disabilities and medical retirements that prevent them from sharing what they know." Sarah realized that she was holding her breath. The scope of what Colonel Peterson was describing went far beyond her individual experience and suggested that the operations she had been part of were connected to a much larger pattern of activities. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Peterson returned to his seat and looked directly into her eyes. I want you to help me understand what really happened during those operations. I want to know how a unit that officially didn't exist managed to accomplish objectives that the entire intelligence community had failed to achieve. And I want to make sure that the capabilities and knowledge developed by that unit aren't completely lost. He paused, letting the weight of his request settle between them. But most importantly, I want to make sure that the people who served in that unit receive the recognition and support they've earned, even if that recognition has to remain classified. Sarah felt a rush of emotions that she had been suppressing for months. The validation that someone in authority understood the significance of her work was intoxicating, but it was tempered by years of training that emphasized the importance of protecting operational security above all other considerations. I can't talk about specific operations, she said finally. Even if I wanted to, I took oaths that I still consider binding. Colonel Peterson nodded, as if he had expected that response. I'm not asking you to compromise operational security or reveal specific details about missions. What I'm interested in is understanding the structure and capabilities of a unit you served with, how it was organized, how it selected and trained personnel, how it maintained security while operating outside normal command structures. He opened another folder and withdrew a document that Sarah recognized as a standard debriefing form, though this one was marked with classification level she had rarely seen during her career. The Department of Defense is considering establishing a new psychological operations capability, Colonel Peterson explained. Something that can operate with the flexibility and effectiveness that your unit demonstrated, but with proper oversight and support structures. The people making those decisions need to understand what worked and what didn't work about the previous approach. Sarah stared at the debriefing form, recognizing that it represented a crossroads that would determine the direction of the rest of her life. She could decline to participate and return to her routine of medical appointments and disability benefits and the slow erosion of her sense of purpose and identity. Or she could choose to trust Colonel Peterson and contribute to something that might ensure that other service members wouldn't face the same isolation and abandonment that had defined her transition to civilian life. If I agree to participate in this debriefing, Sarah said carefully, what happens to the information I provide? Who sees it? And how is it used? Colonel Peterson's expression became more serious, and Sarah recognized the look of someone who was about to make commitments that he would be held accountable for. The information you provide would be classified at the highest levels and shared only with officials who have been cleared for access to special access programs. It would be used solely for the purpose of developing future psychological operations capabilities, not for any kind of investigation or disciplinary action. He leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of someone making a personal promise rather than an official statement. More importantly, your participation in this process will be documented in your personnel file in a way that reflects the true nature of your service. No one outside the intelligence community would ever know the details, but the people making decisions about veteran benefits and medical care would understand that your injuries were sustained in service to operations of critical national importance. Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since her medical retirement. The idea that someone in authority might finally understand the true cost of her service was overwhelming in ways she hadn't anticipated. I need to think about this, she said, her voice thick with emotions she was struggling to control. Colonel Peterson stood up and moved around his desk, stopping in front of her wheelchair. Take all the time you need, he said, but I want you to know that the work you did matters, and the sacrifice you made matters. The fact that it can't be officially acknowledged doesn't make it any less significant. He handed her another business card, this one with a different phone number written on the back. This is my direct line. When you're ready to talk, call me, day or night. Sarah accepted the card and tucked it into her wheelchair bag next to the ghost patch that had started this entire conversation. As she prepared to leave, Colonel Peterson spoke again. There's one more thing you should know, he said. You're not the only member of your unit that we've located. There are others who are dealing with similar challenges, people who are struggling to find their place in a world that doesn't understand what they've done or what they've sacrificed. He returned to his desk and withdrew a photograph that he handed to Sarah. It showed a group of people in military fatigues, their faces partially obscured by the tactical gear they were wearing. But Sarah recognized several of them immediately, people she had served with during her operational career and hadn't seen since her medical retirement. They're scattered across the country now, Colonel Peterson said. Different VA hospitals, different disability ratings, different stories about how they were injured and why they can't talk about their service. But they all have one thing in common. They're trying to rebuild their lives after serving in a unit that officially never existed. Sarah stared at the photograph, feeling a connection to her former colleagues that she had thought was lost forever. The isolation that had been one of the most difficult aspects of her transition suddenly felt less complete, replaced by the possibility of reconnection with people who understood what she had experienced. "If I agree to participate in this debriefing," she said, looking up at Colonel Peterson, "would I have the opportunity to reconnect with other members of my unit?" Colonel Peterson's smile was genuine this time, warm with the satisfaction of someone who had just played his most persuasive card. "I was hoping you would ask that question," he said, "because I think you'll find that they're just as eager to reconnect with you as you are to reconnect with them." As Sarah left the Pentagon that afternoon, she carried with her more than just business cards and photographs. For the first time since her injury, she had a sense that her story wasn't over, that the chapters of her life as Staff Sergeant Martinez might not be the final ones. The questions about what she would choose to share with Colonel Peterson remained unanswered, but the possibility of reconnection with her unit and recognition of her service had awakened something that had been dormant for too long. The drive home felt different than the drive to the Pentagon had that morning. Instead of anxiety and uncertainty, Sarah found herself planning and strategizing in ways that reminded her of preparing for operational deployments. She had decisions to make and risks to evaluate, but for the first time in months, those decisions felt like they mattered beyond just her own survival and comfort. The ghost patch in her wheelchair bag was no longer just a memento of a life that was over. It had become a symbol of possibilities that she was just beginning to understand, connections that might be restored, and a future that might include purpose and meaning beyond medical appointments and disability benefits. The woman who had been dismissed as the wheelchair freak was beginning to remember that she had once been something much more significant, and that significance might not be lost forever after all. 2 weeks after her meeting with Colonel Peterson, Sarah found herself in a secure conference room in a building she had never seen before, surrounded by faces she hadn't expected to see again. The reunion was simultaneously exactly what she had hoped for, and nothing like she had imagined it would be. Marcus Thompson sat directly across from her, his left arm ending in a prosthetic that he manipulated with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had adapted to his new reality. The last time Sarah had seen him, he had been rappelling from a helicopter onto a rooftop in Kandahar, his hand steady on his rifle as he provided overwatch for an operation that had prevented a suicide bombing at a market where children bought school supplies. To his left was Jennifer Kim, whose face bore the subtle scarring of someone who had survived an explosion at close range. The hearing aid in her right ear was nearly invisible, but Sarah recognized the way Jennifer positioned herself to compensate for partial hearing loss. During their operational career, Jennifer had been the team's specialist in electronic surveillance and digital infiltration, capable of penetrating computer networks that national intelligence agencies had deemed impregnable. David Rodriguez looked the most physically intact of the group, but Sarah had learned during her own experience with invisible injuries that appearances could be deceiving. The way he kept his hands flat on the table and avoided sudden movements suggested neurological damage that might not be immediately obvious to casual observers. David had been their language specialist, fluent in 7 dialects, and capable of adopting regional accents so convincingly that native speakers accepted him as one of their own. The fifth member of their reunion was someone Sarah had hoped she would never see again under any circumstances. Captain Michael Harrison had been their commanding officer during their operational deployment, and his presence in the conference room suggested that whatever Colonel Peterson was planning was more significant than Sarah had initially understood. Harrison's left leg was gone from the knee down, replaced by a prosthetic that was more advanced than anything Sarah had seen before. Colonel Peterson sat at the head of the table, flanked by two other officers whose ranks and affiliations Sarah didn't immediately recognize. The walls of the conference room were lined with electronic equipment that hummed quietly, indicating that the conversation they were about to have was being recorded and monitored in ways that suggested significance far beyond a simple debriefing. "I want to thank all of you for agreeing to participate in this process," Colonel Peterson began, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone initiating an official proceeding. "Before we begin, I want to emphasize that everything discussed in this room is classified at the highest levels. The information you share will be used solely for the purpose of developing future operational capabilities, and your participation in this process will be documented in a way that reflects the true nature of your service." He opened a folder and withdrew documents that he distributed to each member of the group. Sarah glanced at hers and recognized it as a more detailed version of the debriefing form she had seen in Colonel Peterson's office. "What we're asking you to do," Colonel Peterson continued, "is to help us understand how your unit functioned and what made it so effective. We're not interested in the specific details of individual operations, but rather in the structure, training, and methodologies that allowed you to accomplish objectives that conventional units have been unable to achieve." Captain Harrison spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority that Sarah remembered from their operational deployment. "Before we begin, I think it's important for everyone to understand the scope of what we're discussing. The unit we served with conducted operations in 17 countries over a 4-year period. We prevented terrorist attacks that would have killed thousands of civilians, disrupted weapons trafficking networks that were supplying insurgent groups across 3 continents, and gathered intelligence that led to the capture of high-value targets that conventional intelligence agencies had been unable to locate." He paused, looking around the table at his former subordinates. "We did this work without any of the support structures that conventional military units take for granted. No official logistics chain, no medical evacuation protocols, no communication with higher headquarters during operations. If something went wrong, we were on our own." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with remembering the constant stress of operating without a safety net. Every mission had carried the knowledge that capture or injury would result in disavowal, that their government would deny their existence rather than acknowledge operations that couldn't be publicly defended. Marcus Thompson shifted in his chair, the movement causing his prosthetic arm to catch the light from the overhead fluorescence. "The thing that made us effective," he said, "was also the thing that made us expendable. We were completely compartmentalized from normal military structures, which meant we could operate with flexibility that conventional units couldn't match. But it also meant that when we were no longer useful, we could be discarded without anyone in the regular military even knowing we had existed." Jennifer Kim's voice was quiet but clear when she spoke. "I've been thinking about this for months, ever since Colonel Peterson first contacted me. What we did was important, and we were good at it. But the cost was higher than anyone calculated when they designed our unit." She gestured toward the group around the table. "Look at us. We're all disabled, all medically retired, all struggling to adapt to civilian life after serving in operations that we can't acknowledge or discuss. The psychological impact of that isolation is something that no one planned for or prepared us to handle." David Rodriguez nodded, his hands still motionless on the table. "The worst part," he said, "isn't the physical injuries or the disabilities. It's the way our service has been erased. When people see us, they see broken veterans who couldn't handle the stress of military life. They have no idea what we accomplished or what we sacrificed to accomplish it." Colonel Peterson was taking notes, but Sarah could see that he was also studying the group dynamics with the attention of someone who understood that the emotional reality of their experience was as important as the tactical details of their operations. "Tell me about the training process," Colonel Peterson said. "How were you selected and prepared for this type of work?" Captain Harrison took the lead in answering, describing a selection process that had been designed to identify service members with specific psychological profiles and skill sets. The training had lasted 14 months and had included instruction in languages, cultural studies, advanced psychology, and techniques for maintaining cover identities over extended periods. The most important part of the training, Harrison explained, was learning to think like the people we would be operating against. We spent months studying the psychology of terrorism, the social structures that support extremist organizations, and the economic factors that make individuals vulnerable to radicalization. Sarah found herself adding details about the psychological aspects of their training, describing exercises that had taught them to adopt completely different personalities and maintain those personas under extreme stress. The training had been unlike anything offered to conventional military units, combining elements of method acting, advanced psychology, and intelligence tradecraft. "We were taught to become whoever we needed to be to accomplish the mission," Sarah explained. "Not just changing our appearance or learning to speak different languages, but actually thinking and feeling like completely different people." It was incredibly effective operationally, but it made readjusting to normal life extremely difficult. Marcus Thompson described the physical training they had received, which had emphasized endurance and adaptability over raw strength. "We had to be able to operate in any environment, under any conditions, for extended periods without support. The physical demands were intense, but the psychological demands were even greater." As the debriefing continued, Sarah began to understand the scope of what Colonel Peterson was attempting to accomplish. The questions he asked were designed to create a comprehensive picture of their unit's capabilities and methodologies, but they also seemed intended to document the human cost of operating outside normal military structures. "One of the things we're trying to understand," Colonel Peterson said during a break in the proceedings, "is how to preserve the operational effectiveness of your unit's approach while providing better support for the personnel involved. The capabilities you developed are too valuable to lose, but the cost in terms of human casualties is unacceptable." Jennifer Kim looked up from the notes she had been taking. "The problem isn't just the physical casualties," she said. "It's the psychological isolation that comes from serving in a unit that officially doesn't exist. When we were injured and retired, we lost not just our careers, but our entire sense of identity and purpose." She gestured toward the group. "Look how long it took for us to reconnect with each other. 18 months of thinking we were alone, that no one understood what we had been through or what we had accomplished. That isolation is as damaging as any physical injury." David Rodriguez nodded emphatically. "The hardest part of civilian life isn't adapting to my disabilities," he said. "It's listening to people dismiss military service members as frauds or exaggerators, knowing that I can't defend myself or my colleagues because our work was classified." Sarah felt a rush of recognition at his words. "That's exactly right," she said. "When people see me in my wheelchair, they make assumptions about my service that are completely wrong. But I can't correct those assumptions without revealing information that could compromise operations that are probably still ongoing." Colonel Peterson was writing rapidly, and Sarah realized that the emotional impact of their service was being documented as carefully as the tactical details. The conversation continued for several hours, covering topics that range from operational security protocols to the psychological techniques they had used to maintain their cover identities. As the formal debriefing concluded, Colonel Peterson made an announcement that surprised everyone in the room. "Based on what you've shared today, the Department of Defense has authorized me to offer each of you the opportunity to participate in the development of a new psychological operations capability. This would involve serving as trainers and advisors for a unit that would operate with proper support structures and oversight. He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes individually. This wouldn't be operational deployment. You would be working in training facilities and secure environments, sharing your expertise with a new generation of service members who would carry on the work you pioneered. The silence that followed his announcement was heavy with consideration and possibility. Sarah felt her heart racing as she processed what Colonel Peterson was offering. The chance to return to meaningful service, to contribute to something larger than her own survival and medical appointments, was more than she had dared to hope for. Marcus Thompson was the first to respond. Would this work be officially acknowledged? He asked. Would the people we train know who we are and what we've done? Colonel Peterson smiled. Within the classified community, yes. Your service records would be amended to reflect the true nature of your work, and the people you train would understand exactly who they're learning from. You would receive the recognition you've earned, even if that recognition has to remain classified. Jennifer Kim's voice was cautious, but hopeful. What about medical support? Will we have access to health care that understands the unique nature of our injuries and disabilities? You would have access to medical facilities that specialize in treating service members injured during classified operations, Colonel Peterson replied. Doctors who understand the psychological and physical impact of extended deep cover operations and who have clearances that allow them to provide care with full knowledge of your service history. Sarah realized that tears were running down her face, but she didn't care. The validation that someone in authority finally understood what they had sacrificed and what they were capable of contributing was overwhelming. There's one more thing, Colonel Peterson said, his voice gentler than it had been during the formal debriefing. The new unit would include provisions for supporting service members who were injured during operations. Medical retirement wouldn't mean abandonment and isolation. It would mean transition to different roles within the same community with full support and recognition. Captain Harrison spoke for the group. I think I can speak for everyone when I say that we're interested in hearing more about this opportunity. The chance to serve again, to contribute to something meaningful while receiving the support we should have had all along, is exactly what we've been hoping for. As the meeting concluded and the group prepared to leave, Sarah felt a transformation taking place that went beyond just the prospect of returning to service. The reunion with her colleagues had reminded her of who she was beyond her disabilities and medical appointments. She was Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, Psychological Operations Specialist, member of a unit that had accomplished things most people couldn't imagine. The drive home was different from any she had taken since her injury. Instead of the familiar routine of processing medical appointments and managing pain, Sarah found herself planning and strategizing in ways that reminded her of preparing for operational deployment. She had decisions to make and a future to consider that extended far beyond survival and adaptation. 3 months later, Sarah reported for duty at a secure facility in Virginia where she would spend her days training the next generation of psychological operations specialists. Her wheelchair had been equipped with additional communication devices that allowed her to interface directly with the advanced simulation systems used for training. Her colleagues from the debriefing had accepted similar positions, creating a team of instructors whose combined experience represented decades of successful operations in the most challenging environments imaginable. The work was demanding and fulfilling in ways that Sarah had thought were lost forever. The trainees she worked with understood exactly who she was and what she had accomplished. Her disabilities were relevant only insofar as they informed her teaching about the risks and realities of operational deployment. Her wheelchair wasn't a symbol of failure or victimization. It was evidence of the price she had paid for serving at the highest levels of her profession. The ghost patch that had started her journey toward reconnection and recognition now hung in a place of honor in her new office, alongside commendations and certificates that officially acknowledged her contributions to operations of critical national importance. The patch still represented classified work that couldn't be publicly discussed, but within the community that mattered, it was recognized as a symbol of expertise and sacrifice that had earned the highest respect. Sarah's story had transformed from one of isolation and abandonment to one of recognition and renewed purpose. She was no longer the wheelchair freak that people whispered about in VA waiting rooms. She was Staff Sergeant Martinez, instructor and advisor, member of an elite community that understood the true cost of defending national security in an increasingly complex world. The whispers she heard now were different. They came from trainees discussing the lessons they had learned from her, from colleagues seeking her advice on complex operational challenges, and from administrators documenting her contributions to the development of capabilities that would protect American lives for decades to come. Most importantly, Sarah had learned that her story wasn't defined by her injuries or her limitations, but by her choices about how to respond to the challenges she faced. She had chosen to trust Colonel Peterson with secrets she had never intended to share. She had chosen to reconnect with colleagues who understood her experience in ways that no one else could. And she had chosen to contribute her expertise to ensuring that future service members wouldn't face the isolation and abandonment that had defined her transition to civilian life. The woman who had been dismissed and ignored had become someone whose expertise was sought and valued. The service member who had been discarded when she was no longer operationally useful had found a new way to serve that was even more meaningful than her original career. And the veteran who had thought her story was over had discovered that the most important chapters were just beginning. Sarah's transformation from victim to instructor, from isolated patient to valued colleague, from forgotten veteran to recognized expert, represented something larger than individual success. It demonstrated the possibility that service members who sacrifice for classified operations don't have to disappear when their operational careers end. With proper support and recognition, they can continue contributing their expertise and experience to the defense of the nation they served, ensuring that their sacrifices contribute to something lasting and meaningful. The ghost patch in her office served as a daily reminder that some stories are too important to remain hidden forever, and that recognition, even when it must remain classified, has the power to transform lives and restore purpose to those who have given everything in service to their country.